Okay, everyone. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, whenever it is that you're listening to this. Welcome to our third installment on Richard Nixon. The second one that we are going to pay attention to his domestic policies. Um, so technically 1970. We're talking about early 1970s. When we're talking about Richard Nixon, it's the early 1970s. His presidency ends in 1974. So, we still got, much more of a decade to discuss, which we will later on. So, keep in mind, Richard Nixon is the very last couple of years of the 60s and the first couple of years, 3 or 4 years of the 70s. But, if we're going to talk about the 70s, I mean, the beginning is the beginning. And so, we do talk about Nixon. And like I said, we're going to discuss more of his domestic policies. So, let's talk about a phenomenon. How did the Democratic Party, being the party of Thomas Jefferson, being the one of the original parties in this country that was traditionally a Southern party, the party of the planter class, the party of, at one time, the party of slavery, the party of, states' rights, the party of the South, and then later on, the party of Jim Crow. How did this party lose the South? How did we end up where we are today? In that the South, with some exceptions, is solidly red. And what I mean by red, firmly within the camp of the Republican Party. Something that if you would have suggested during Reconstruction, was like, well, you're crazy. The South will never become Republican. But that's exactly what happened. The theory, um, civil rights, starts with starts with Truman and his integration of the armed forces. You hear the first rumblings of discontent in that big tent among the Dixiecrats, Democrats that were Democrats because their dads and their granddads and their great granddads were Democrats because that's just what it was in the South. And it had been since Reconstruction and before slavery. Um, Social conservatives, particularly when it came to race, the race slash caste system that had existed for centuries in the South, and Truman begins to create waves and the first inklings of discontent with Strom Thurmond's campaign in 48. It was a third party campaign, but it was a protest campaign. It was important because it showed the beginnings of Dixiecrat discontent in the South towards a Democratic Party that little by little they felt was straying away from the social conservative platform that made Dixiecrats for so long. And then, then comes JFK and his asking for remember, and FDR little by little gave in to, the end of discrimination in the defense industry. Eisenhower didn't want to touch civil rights. JFK did, but only told the very end of his life. But it was when Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president. That's it. When Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president, he's going to go full throttle into supporting civil rights. The gamble that he's making is a guy from Texas, a guy that was known to be, by our standards, racist. I'm going to replace those Dixiecrats with black voters. That was the whole point of, many would argue the Civil Rights Bill of 64 and the Voting Rights Bill of 65. So the argument is, now you have all these Dixiecrats, these disaffected Dixiecrats that they feel abandoned by their party. They don't belong in that party anymore. Their party has moved on. Their party has become the party of civil rights. And this transformation started with FDR. And the Republicans are not stupid. Those are potential voters. How do we bring those voters into the Republican tent without coming off as outright racist? But how do we bring those, the Democrats decided to drop that role. How do we bring them into the tent? And we see the beginning of this with the emergence in 1964 of Barry Goldwater, who's considered the father of modern American conservatism, of neoconservatism. He doesn't go out there and say, well, let's go right back to segregation and et cetera, et cetera. No, 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 no. Talks about states' rights. He's conservative. His platform is the federal government should not interfere. The states' rights should be respected. And, for all intents and purposes, take with it what you will. He extends that to civil rights, and the government interfering in, integration, segregation laws, for example, is too much. It's overreach from the federal government. So, you're going to see a lot of this, and we've seen it before. Some of the most dubious causes in this country's history masked under the banner of civil rights. In '64, Barry Goldwater is the first Republican in many elections to win a significant number of the South's electoral votes. He wins Arizona because he's from Arizona. The rest of the Republic, well, this guy's on to something, okay? If we become the party of states' rights and we couch it in language that big government is bad government, federal overreach leads to violations of personal liberties, and states' rights are something that should be almost sacred cows, we could bring those people in. It is all dog whistle. In '68, third-party candidate George Wallace, who's outright racist, segregation now, segregation forever, he doesn't come close. But what does he do? He wins the very states, with the exception of South Carolina and Arkansas, that Goldwater won 4 years earlier. So again, the Republicans are, how do we court those states? So here we go to the Southern strategy. How do you appeal to middle class, blue collar, white, conservative, specifically socially conservative voters across the South that feel abandoned by the Democratic Party? You bring them in, okay? You bring them in with dog whistle politics. For example, take Lee Atwater, Republican strategist after Nixon, but nonetheless, he was in. Throughout the Reagan years, RNC chair from '89 to '91, he gave this quote in an interview, kind of a controversial interview. He says, you don't quote me on this. You start out in 1954 by saying N-word, N-word, N-word. You could get away with that back then. By 1968, the world had changed. You can't say the N-word. That hurts you. That backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, all that stuff. You create this narrative of the welfare mom living in the inner city with a gazillion kids living off of welfare, the poor living off of welfare. And when you couch it in that language, you manufacture that narrative, ultimately they know who this hurts. He even admitted it. Okay? This is how you turn out the racist vote. By not couching it in outright, out in the open racist language, but gift wrapping it in language that you could use in civilized society out in the open, but among those that, know the cues to listen for, they know very well what they're listening to. Okay, this is how the Republican Party courted the South. Basically courted and seduced all those disaffected Dixiecrats into the South. The process was complete by Reagan. Nixon only demonstrated it, particularly in '72, that if you court this type of voter, the Republican Party could carry the South, and it did, and it has. And George Wallace very much was a barometer for this. So let's talk about civil rights and Nixon. Nixon was early in his career, he was not against Martin Luther King and civil disobedience and peaceful resistance and all that. He had very positive things to say about Martin Luther King. He was one of the early Republicans, even before he was president, that actually tried to get his party to adopt something of a civil rights platform. And by the time he gets president, it's not King in charge anymore. It's the Black Panthers. It's people like Stokely Carmichael. a more militant, confrontational, almost black nationalist conversation has replaced the old one, and he's not up for that. So of course he's totally fine with dismantling those sorts of civil rights activists. He did give the green light for Hoover to carry out COINTELPRO, which had been going on for a while, but it went on in earnest during Nixon's administration. He knew very well what it was doing. Talk about busing. A number of schools continued to be very segregated. The federal government began encourage school districts to bus children, sometimes long distances from one school to another, to have, with the idea of having integrated schools. The integrated populations were a worthwhile part of the educational experience of children. Nixon was not a big fan. He felt that forced integration was just as bad as segregation. He called for a freeze of integration busing, even blocked the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare from denying federal funds to schools that resisted busing. But eventually, he was not successful there, and his efforts were overturned by a Supreme Court case that we're going to discuss a little bit later. Nixon, ironically, gives us our first of what would be called an affirmative action program. Nixon's Philadelphia Plan was an early affirmative action initiative that required federal contractors and unions to submit goals and timetables for minority hiring. That's the first type of, government mandate when it came to civil rights and minority hiring. The first thing, which later on we would call these affirmative action programs, came out of the Nixon administration. But this is a slide that's worth freezing, pausing and reading. Suffice to say that many of the younger civil rights activists have pretty much given up in capitalism, at least capitalism as being a vehicle for black progress. And that was the sort of talk that Nixon was not really on board with. Nixon was a conservative, very much a conservative. Nixon came into the presidency riding a wave of middle-class, Main Street, middle America discontent and disagreement and even anger towards the counterculture. So, Nixon is has a response for people like Fred Hampton, for example. Isn't it interesting that Fred Hampton was assassinated within a year of President Nixon being elected? Rather than socialism, okay, government programs, reparations was even part of the conversation. Nixon advocated for black capitalism. We know there's poverty, there's inequality in the black community. Instead of government programs, like your New Deal liberals proposed, or even reparations, that some of the more alternative civil rights activists were asking for at the time, Nixon offered tax breaks, incentives, and private enterprise as a solution to poverty and inequality in the black community. He told them, listen, you don't need the government to help you. You need to help yourself. Now, here we are, practically 50 years later. Did it work? I mean, you still have your Jay-Z's. You still have much of, contemporary hip-hop music today that if you sit down and actually read the lyrics and listen to the lyrics, that's exactly what they're promoting. If not black capitalism, black consumerism. And this comes from that's an ad for Nixon's '72 campaign. You should read it, along with a quote by Fred Hampton. This is a slide that's worth pausing. So yes, black capitalism is pretty much Nixon's alternative to the Great Society programs that were aimed at alleviating poverty and inequality in the African American community, because Richard Nixon was no friend of the Great Society. Richard Nixon hoped that he could affect the court, the Supreme Court. Earl Warren, the famous liberal judge that was responsible for so many groundbreaking liberal decisions of the court during the civil rights period in the 50s and 60s, was, Nixon felt, I have the opportunity to replace him with a conservative judge, Earl Burger. He does, and then Burger surprises him. Burger is not as conservative as Nixon thought he was. And they almost continue the tradition of the Warren Court. Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg. The court said that yes, um, integration busing was not unconstitutional. On the contrary, advanced the purposes of education. You know, they said it was not unconstitutional, and they actually encouraged it even more so. Furman versus Georgia. For a number of years during the Nixon years, it got rid of the death penalty in all 50 states, claiming that the statutes that existed at that time pertaining to capital punishment were unconstitutional. So that's a pretty liberal decision from a court that Nixon had hoped was conservative. And then one we're still wrestling with today. It's out of the Burger Court that we end up with the very, very, very consequential case of Roe versus Wade. Therefore, claiming that abortions were were legal and the right of every woman in this country. And we've been, we've been fighting with that one ever since. So, like I said, Richard Nixon was a conservative. Richard Nixon had very little to no love to for the Great Society, the LBJ, and well, you remember the Great Society is an extension of the New Deal, and he has a different mindset. A mindset that you hear in conservatism today. Too much government is bad. It infringes on personal freedoms. It infringes on prosperity. Government regulations hurt companies. They don't profit. They don't profit. Economic growth is hurt, and therefore we should deregulate. We should not have the safety net that we have, and if we had rugged individualism, people would actually do a better job in taking care of themselves. So he's coming in, trying to do the best he can to dismantle the Great Society. Richard Nixon's new conservatism. It's going to take the form of four things: new federalism, which we're going to discuss in the next slide. Welfare reform, of course. He does want to dismantle many of the things that came out of the Great Society. Two faces, okay, he's a contradiction, okay, because federal spending does go up during his presidency. And then law and order politics. Probably the most useful way that he appealed to the silent majority, this white, conservative, middle class, middle America, mainstream, usually rural and small town voter. America's out of control. The young people are out of control. Minorities are out of control. And we need law and order in this country. And I'm going to give you law and order. That's a surefire way to get votes from conservatives. Tell them they're under attack, and tell them that you're the man that's going to institute law and order. On the sides there, you get some of the more important faces in modern conservatism. Robert Taft, the son of President Taft, Mr. Conservative in the 1950s. Of course, Senator McCarthy, the McCarthy trials. Ronald Reagan, who's going to go on in the 1980s to he's going to carry the baton of modern conservatism into the 1980s. Barry Goldwater, the father of modern conservatism in this country. Milton Friedman, all the way there in the bottom, the father of, not the father of, but pretty much the most important cheerleader for free market economics, post-New Deal, post-Great Society. And William Buckley, the guy they claim that pretty much a theoretician of modern American conservatism. Let's talk about new federalism. Again, this is Southern strategy. How do you appeal to Southern voters? You highlight and you point out states' rights, states' rights, states' rights. Big government is bad. I'm going to shrink the size of the government. I'm going to shrink the size of the federal government. How? By passing on control over domestic programs to the states. And you look on paper, and what happens on paper, it looks like the federal government is shrinking. Absolutely. Why is that? because you're passing stuff over to the states. While you're shrinking the size of the federal government and you're telling everybody, hey, look, the government's shrinking, guess what's expanding? State governments. But that's okay because the philosophy is states know what is best, what is for their people more than the federal government. There's always this anti-Washington tendency there. If federalism used to function like that dual federalism cake, that there was a clear difference between the federal government and the state governments, what Nixon introduced with his new federalism is what we refer to as marble cake. A mix of federal government, state government sharing powers, funding, responsibilities. Okay? If your AP government class, they probably spoken about this as first order devolution. Transferring the power over domestic programs from the central government over to the states. And we've moved on. Okay? In the years that followed, it will be second order devolution. Passing the transferring from the state governments to local governments. Then third order devolution. That's where you get your charter schools. That's where you get your HMOs. That's where you get your private prisons. The passing over of function of programs from the government to private entities. Okay? All this is very conservative. Trying to little by little take things away from the government and push them into the private sector. But that's further ahead than we need to go. Nixon's new federalism, in order to court that southern voter, the one that's very into states' rights, that shrink the size of the federal government, passes responsibilities over to the states. The block grant becomes a part of this. Okay, we're not going to tell you how to spend your money. We're going to put Medicare in your lap. We're going to put Medicare in your lap. We're going to put food stamps in your lap. And we're going to give you a big chunk of money to take care of it. Okay? You can spend it on that or not. And what you spend on those programs is up to you. So this went a long way to advancing that conversation about shrinking the size of government and expanding the power of the states. And again, it was meant to court that kind of voter. And you can't, be a conservative and say that the New Deal was overreach and a mistake and the Great Society was a mistake if you're not going to go after the safety net that the Great Society created. So welfare reform is very much going to be part of Nixon's goals, if you will. He's going to go after the aid to families with dependent children. That had been around since 1935. That was a New Deal program. The argument was, and it lifted millions of people out of poverty. It lifted millions of people out of poverty. The conservative argument is, and this is the conservative argument against the safety net, against the welfare state. Good intentions. Welfare was meant to help out people in times of need. What you end up doing is creating, and this is a straw man. You end up creating an entire class of people that will not want to work because there's no incentive to work and will be dependent on the government. And who is this supposed to anger? Mom and pop taxpayer. Is there race thrown into this? Yes, very covertly. Hey, because you know who's using up our tax dollars. And, think about that. He tries to get rid of that program. He fails. You know who succeeds? Clinton, many years later. That's ironic, isn't it? Nixon gets rid of the equal employment opportunity, the Office of Equal Employment Opportunity. That came out during the Great Society. But what he tries to replace it with is something very interesting. Nixon tried to propose, as an alternative to aid to families with dependent children, which was, this is money, if you have kids and you fall in low income or no income families, here's money for each kid. And this is where you get this narrative, they're just having kids because with every kid they have, they get a check. He actually introduced a very early version of UBI, of Universal Basic Income. And I tell people, that's a conservative idea. Milton Friedman was on board with that. That is not a liberal idea. That is not a left idea. You're giving people cash, putting cash in people's hands and telling them, take this cash to go on the market, okay, private enterprise, and take care of your problems instead of relying on a government program, which requires a government bureaucracy and tax dollars to put together. Here's the money, go get it yourself, okay? The family assistance plan was supposed to work. Um, all low-income families were going to get $1,600 a year, which at the time was a lot of money. Adjusted for inflation, I don't know what it would be today. And you could get even more if you worked. And dependent on how many hours you worked, you could get up to $4,000 more, okay, as from the government, in addition to that $1,600. Long story short, it was bounced around in Congress for a number of years and eventually was defeated in 1972 because, ironically, it was the conservatives in Congress that did not like the idea of a guaranteed income. Okay? And that for many, then that, that was Nixon's take on it, and it is very right wing. Give people money in their hands, let them go out into the market. It stimulates private enterprise to take care of their problems instead of using tax dollars to fund a government program to do the same. Wow, that date kind of cut off there. Um, this is well, he didn't start it. This started by JFK, if you remember. But Richard Nixon definitely benefits from. Um, and it's ironic, at the peak of their greatest success, Richard Nixon's actually going to begin the process of defunding NASA. Okay. Apollo 11 moon landing. Everybody knows that's when Armstrong steps off the moon. Right there in the reflection of the helmet, you could see Stanley Kubrick's camera crew. No, I'm kidding. That's not a studio. That's the moon. Um, and what does it have to do with Nixon? It's ironic. Right at the peak of our greatest space race victory is when the plan to defund NASA comes into play. There's only going to be a couple more Apollo missions because they were extremely expensive. And then NASA is going to transfer over into the much more affordable space shuttle program. And that's why we are where we are today. We have to rebuild a, uh, a rocket program, the likes of which we had in the 1960s. We don't have now. We had to start from scratch, basically. And so here's a picture that everybody should, we took this for granted on, I think it was the last flight. The crew of Apollo 11 took this picture on December 7th, 1972. And it put a lot of things into perspective, There's a lot of egos floating around and people that think they're important and this and that. But don't forget, this is, you live on this ball here, on this sphere. We all do. And it's the only home we have. So, this is a lead up to, well, let's say some positive things about Nixon's presidency. Nixon thought himself as very conservative. And Nixon wrote a conservative wave into the White House. But if you scratch the surface, you do find exceptions. You do find contradictions. Nixon did not think that environmentalism was some liberal hoax. He thought it was worthwhile and important. First Earth Day is celebrated April 22nd, 1970. A lot of this is the counterculture. There were elements of the counterculture that took those energies that they had invested into ending the war and into expanding civil rights, and they diverted them into other areas. Environmentalism is one of them. Animal rights is another one. Greenpeace came out of the counterculture. Um, the federal government, not since Theodore Roosevelt did they take as serious of a look at, listen, progress has a price. The price that we have been paying is that we have been poisoning our air and our waters. Okay? And we are, poisoning our people with this. So, and Here's, we talk about China being polluted in cities in India being equal to like a pack of cigarettes a day. Until not that very long ago, before environmental protections and regulations existed, this was pretty much the permanent state of our three largest cities. Our three largest cities choked on smog on a daily basis, not just because of industrialization, not just of industry, okay, but it was coming out of the tailpipes in many of our cars. We were burning leaded gas at that time. We were poisoning our population with lead. We were exposed to more environmental lead than at any point. We had lead in our pipe fittings. We had lead in our paint, and we were breathing in lead because, the emissions were spitting it out. Okay? So yes, Nixon was Republican, Nixon was a conservative, but Nixon understood that we had to take care of the environment. In that, he has a direct line to Teddy Roosevelt. Three important pieces of legislation addressing the environment. Nobody addressed climate change yet. It wasn't talked about. In the scientific community, they knew about it. Public knowledge, not yet. But they did discuss pollution, air pollution, water pollution. 1970 Clean Air Act. I mean, I'm not going to go over it because we don't have a ton of time. But this is definitely something that you want to pause and look at. The Clean Air Act of 1970 that was signed into law by President Nixon. The Clean Water Act of 1972, another one signed into law by President Nixon and has made great gains. The Endangered Species Act of 1973, signed into law by President Nixon. So again, President Nixon, Republican, conservative, and environmentalist. What happened? Why did the Republican Party decide to walk away from environmentalism? I have no idea. Here's the biggest surprise of all. Guess who created the Environmental Protection Agency? You know that government agency that regulates businesses, particularly ones that do pollute, and forces them to comply to environmental, regulations. Richard Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency on December 2nd, 1970. It's the Environmental Protection Agency that enforces the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. That's not the only one. Another surprise that came, a curveball from Richard Nixon. He signed OSHA into existence, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Labor unions are acting, ever since the 1950s when they purged all the socialists and all the communists because of the Taft-Hartley bill. Unions, believe it or not, there's conservative unions out there. Hard hat rights, those construction workers, AFL-CIO, they were conservative. Okay, they were pro-Nixon. So he throws them a bone as well, which is good for everyone. Politics aside, looking out for workplace safety and creating a federal agency that regulates industry and business. That's ironic too, created by a Republican. So, Nixon is full of surprises, from the EPA to OSHA to going to China and meet with Mao, and to Soviet Union to meet with Brezhnev. He was, he was a challenge, to those that, have a tendency of judging books by their cover. He did have his moments of deviating from expectations. And what about the economy? All right, this is going to take a bit of a talk. And it started before Nixon, and it's going to continue after Nixon. And this period in American history is referred to as the Great Inflation. And if you don't know what Great inflation means, it means the noticeable, if not dramatic, increase in prices. Okay, they outpace wages. Okay, if wages are keeping up, that's fine. But if not, it eats away at purchasing power and ultimately quality of life. Now, why was this happening? Causes behind the we're going to talk more about economics as we get into the mid to late 70s. What caused the Great Inflation? The, the, the common knowledge thinking behind most post-war economists was the most important goal economically that we have to maintain is full employment. Full employment is tied to productivity. The more people working, the more productive our economy is. The more productive our economy is, the economy grows. This is classic Keynesianism that came after World War II. And of course, Keynesianism became the dominant economic approach towards macroeconomic policies around the Western world. Okay, um, and the government was of the opinion, you know, we have to prime the pump. If we have to get money out there in order to entice employers to invest and to hire, then we will put money out there. And we will print money if need be. Here is the problem, okay? And you print a lot of money, okay? Here's the problem. When you print a lot of money, what happens to its intrinsic worth? The more of anything you have, what happens to its intrinsic worth? It declines, okay? Too much of something brings the overall value of something down. And how is this reflected in price? You have more and more dollars out there being printed by the Fed, and the more the Fed prints, the less they're worth. That means prices are going to require a greater quantity of these dollars. Okay? Prices go up as a result. Okay? The way the Fed is looking at it, if we print a lot of dollars and the dollars, their value, you know, the more we print declines, true, but we could afford to have low interest rates. Okay? We want people to get these dollars off the bank's hands, and the bank gets these dollars out into the economy by having interest rates as low as possible. What does this encourage? Investment. Okay. Um, but ultimately, in the end, it creates a weak dollar, and prices go up as a consequence of weak dollars because you need more and more weak dollars to make up the value of whatever it is that you're trying to sell out there in the economy. You could look here in this graph. So that was the common knowledge. If we keep interest rates low to encourage investment, and we keep plenty of money out there, that's how we put money out. The government puts money out there through interest rates. The lower the interest rate, the more money investors will borrow, and that's the way they put money out into the economy. The problem is too much of it, too much money chasing too few goods. When the supply of money outstrips the demand for goods and services, prices go up. And as you can see here in this graph, we were dealing with significant inflation. All 1974, close to 12%. We're going to talk about how this is resolved. So Nixon walks into a situation that's incredibly inflationary. And by the way, government spending also plays a role to this. The other institutions that are asking for and spending a lot of money. The war in Vietnam is expensive. The Great Society is expensive. So they're fueling this as well. So Nixon is the first. LBJ didn't do anything about it. Nixon is the first of the presidents, is the first one to make it a point to tackle inflation. Okay, because to tackle inflation, if prices are too high, purchasing power declines, quality of life declines, and there's reasons why oil also is plays a role here, but we'll get to that in the next PowerPoint. Nixon Shock. A series of macroeconomic actions that Richard Nixon takes to address this inflationary situation in the United States. And on August 15th, 1971, Richard Nixon ends the international convertibility of dollars to gold because dollars were weak because there were so many out there. International investors didn't want to hold on to these dollars. It's like, why would you want to hold on to stocks that are losing their value? I don't want to hold on to these dollars that are losing their value. So what do? They exchange them for gold. Okay? Remember, FDR got rid of the gold standard, but it continued to exist in international trade because up until this point, the universal currency of international trade was always gold. That was the one currency that countries were always willing to accept. Okay? The U.S., tired of having our reserves drained by foreign investors and foreign countries saying, you know what? We don't want to hold on to these dollars. They don't buy as much as they used to before. They're weak. They're losing value because he prints so much of them. We want to exchange them for gold. And then we have to honor that. Okay, give us the dollars, which creates even more dollars in circulation, which agitates the inflationary situation. Here's your gold. But before long, we're depleting our gold reserves. Okay, and we're getting a bunch of paper back into circulation that only makes the inflationary situation worse. And Nixon says, enough, no more gold to dollars. Okay, now the dollar is going to float. Whatever the dollar's worth is going to be, whatever is going to be determined by the demand that other countries want for the dollar. And this screws everybody up because everybody's currencies were tied to the dollar and the dollar was tied to gold. If the dollar and gold disconnect from each other, then everybody's currency floats as well. From that point forward, pegged currencies were exchanged for floating currencies. And this is really when the currency exchange market is born. Okay? Now what determines the value of currency in international trade is not so much its value in gold, but how much demand for that particular currency exists, and that demand determines the value, how much value that currency has. And this changed everything forever. He ordered a 90-day wage and price freeze, also a very non-conservative thing to do. For 90 days, he ordered that wages should be frozen and prices should be frozen to bring inflation under control. He also ordered a 10-day import surcharge to fix our trade deficit. See, here's the problem. Once upon a time, we were exporting more than we were importing. When we export, how do countries buy American goods? With gold. We were bringing gold into our reserves. But over time, when we start to import more than we export, meaning that American demands for goods and services are so high that our domestic production is not enough to satisfy that demand. We have to import as well. And we import more than we export. Well, guess what? When we import, guess how we pay for those imports? With gold. That's more gold leaving American reserves. Okay, exasperating the problem. So enough. We're not going to have our trade deficit take gold out of our reserves. We're not going to let foreign investors deplete our gold reserves by trading in their dollars for gold. Okay, it stops right now. The dollar and the value of the dollar is determined by the demand for the dollar. And why would anybody want to demand dollars? Because they want to buy American goods and services or petroleum. That's the root of the petrodollar. All petroleum sold in the open market is done so only in dollars. And Nixon tries, but he doesn't solve the inflation program. It alleviates for a short period of time, but the inflation problem continues into the Reagan years. And what we end up with is something called stagflation, which, it's a combination of inflation, low economic growth, high unemployment, recession, poor implementation of government policies. We'll discuss all of this at a future PowerPoint. And that is Nixon for domestic policy. The next time we speak, almost in Shakespearean fashion, we will discuss the fall of Richard Nixon. And the answer to our gut check question is yellow. So make sure that you hear this entire presentation from beginning to end. So at least you know the answer one more time. I'm not going to do this again twice. The answer to our gut check question is yellow. All right, I'll see you next time we do this.